Was life genuinely better in the 90s, or are we just looking at the past through rose-tinted glasses? I've been thinking about this a lot lately because 90s nostalgia is everywhere right now, and I get it. I lived through the 90s as a teenager and young adult in Manchester, and there's a lot to miss about that time. But I also remember we spent much of the 90s being nostalgic for the 60s and 70s. Britpop had that whole 60s swagger going on. We had flares and hippie clothes, and half of us were digging back through old record collections. So even back then, I remember wondering, will there be a 90s revival in a few decades? And sure enough, several years ago, the teenagers I was teaching started asking what life was like in the 90s. The nerdy but edgy kids were wearing Nirvana t-shirts, and those squiggly line graphics started showing up on books and pencil cases everywhere. So today I want to look back on the 90s and consider what we've lost and gained since then, and ask, was it really better? So let's begin with just a few things that made the 90s so special. I'm starting with music because it mattered in a way that's hard to explain if you weren't a young person at the time. It wasn't just background noise, it was culture, identity, and connection. From rave to grunge to Britpop, trip-hop and rap, music gave us a language for things we didn't have words for. And there was a lot of interesting stuff happening in music back then. And that's not just nostalgia talking. Music generally was more creative. If you're a bit of a music nerd, I highly recommend Rick Beato's YouTube channel. He has some great videos which explain how music is officially less creative these days. So no, you're not just getting old. Most mainstream music today really is shit. Okay, I think we can all agree that by far the biggest change since the 90s is smartphones, and thank God they didn't exist back then, because I genuinely think they would have messed me up as a teenager. Even if we could sweep away the minefield of online bullying, ostracism, social comparison, insane beauty standards, not to mention addictions to porn, gaming and gambling, you're still left with the fact that just having the internet and a video camera in your pocket fundamentally changes the social dynamic. The 90s was the last decade where hanging out meant actually being present, and if someone was half an hour late, you just waited. You had to find ways to handle boredom and uncertainty, which are pretty useful life skills, especially boredom. It leads to daydreaming, and daydreaming leads to creativity, and creativity leads to actually making things instead of endlessly consuming. And without phones, there was no documentation of your entire life. No permanent record of every bad choice you made in your youth. You could just exist and figure out who you were without an audience. So the 90s really feels like the last time human connection was completely spontaneous and unfiltered. And I think that's what younger people today are really yearning for. It was also a simpler time because there was just less stimulus and fewer choices. And fewer choices meant we existed in the same cultural universe. Yes, there was counterculture, but it was rebelling against the same mainstream everyone knew about. Now, there is no mainstream to rebel against, just a million little micro-cultures that never intersect. And back then, most people were watching the same TV shows at the same time, seeing the same films together, talking about the same albums and cultural moments together. And even your gran knew who most of the big celebrities were. Now, I'm not quite 50 and I have no idea who half the celebrities are who pop up on TV. And again, I don't think that's just about getting old. I think it's the whole nature of entertainment and celebrity that's changed. Because now we're all in our own little algorithmic bubbles. It means we've lost those shared cultural reference points that acted like social glue. Okay, now here's one that makes me feel old. The world felt safer back then. I used to hear my grandparents talk about how the world had gone mental back in the 80s and 90s, so I guess it's all relative, but they didn't live in a time of random mass shootings and stabbings and car rammings. Life wasn't peachy back in the 80s and 90s. We all knew about stranger danger and serial killers and how to avoid the dodgy kids who hung out on the street corner looking for victims to bully. And yes, that was a bit scary, but I never worried they'd come at me with machetes. Somewhere along the way things shifted and random acts of violence became more common. Yes, we can go about our day-to-day lives like normal, but even if we're not consciously aware of it, that background hum of unease is a massive buzzkill. I'd really hate to be a young person growing up with that. And finally, let's talk about the economy. Now, the 90s in the UK had a rough start, what with poll tax, riots and recession, and I remember my parents really worrying about that. But by the mid to late 90s, there was genuine optimism. The job market was growing and opportunities felt real, and house prices were about 3 times the average salary. Now, unfortunately, I was just a little too young to capitalise on most of that. However, I did go to university for free. My degree cost me absolutely nothing, and at the time, we probably all took that way too much for granted. Because you do when you're young, don't you? It's only later you realise what you've lost, and by then you're never quite sure if it's genuine loss or just rose-tinted nostalgia playing tricks on you. Okay, I think those are some solid arguments for why the 90s were better, but let's be honest, there were some not so great things as well. So let's look at those and what's genuinely better now. There were some aspects of 90s culture that were pretty toxic. Heroin chic, for starters. That gaunt, half-starved look celebrated by the fashion industry and a whole new era of supermodels, claiming that their rail-thin physique was all thanks to a diet of coffee, cigarettes and champagne. It really was not a good time to be a young girl with thick thighs, I can tell you. And overlapping with that was ladette culture. Oh yes, the girls could be just as rowdy, leery, sweary and boozy as the lads. And it was fun and empowering. Or so we thought, but looking back, maybe not so much. The thing about 90s youth culture is that it was hedonism tipping into nihilism. I mean, have you actually listened to the lyrics of Nirvana, Radiohead, Nine Inch Nails? It wasn't happy stuff. But for those of us struggling a bit with mental health at the time, music was basically the only therapy available. Underneath all that eyeliner and attitude, many of us were feeling things deeply that we just didn't have language for. And there were no school counsellors, no online communities. So if you were dealing with something like anxiety or depression or disordered eating or some kind of body dysmorphia or any of that stuff, you were pretty much alone with it. I think that's why there was this whole cultural persona that hinted at hurt beneath a tough exterior. And this is a very tricky one because we do need resilience and you only build that through struggle and challenge. And I gotta be honest, I'm not entirely convinced that today's intense focus on mental health is helpful either. But somewhere there's a middle ground, and I think a lot of us could have used a bit of support back then. So at least today there's recognition that young people do have mental health struggles, there's more awareness and vocabulary for what they're experiencing, and there's just a lot more information and support available. And whilst that might have its own problems, I see that mostly as a good thing. And speaking as a woman now in midlife, I am so glad there's more awareness and conversation about menopause now, because that shit must have been awful and scary for generations of women who didn't fully understand what was happening to their bodies and their minds. And of course, medical science in general has moved forward. Survival rates for HIV and cancer and other major illnesses has massively improved. We understand diet, nutrition and exercise in a way we didn't back then. I mean, we really did not look after ourselves in the 90s. Even the so-called healthy stuff wasn't actually healthy. It was all about cultivating a certain look rather than being strong and living well. And I'm really glad that's changed now. And finally, let's talk about the internet. And I know, like any tool, it's often abused and misused, but can we just take a moment to remember how bloody amazing the internet is? A teenager today can access resources that the world's top universities couldn't dream of back in the 90s. Want to learn quantum physics? Want to research careers? Learn a language? Start a business from your bedroom? Build an app? Learn how to tile your own bathroom, or just know how to fry an egg properly. It's all there at your fingertips. So the democratic access to knowledge, tools and communication is an enormous advantage that we simply didn't have and couldn't even dream of back in the 90s. So was the 90s really better? Here's what I think. We're nostalgic for that feeling that the future was still open. And yeah, there were problems, but they felt solvable. So when we look back at the 90s, I think what we're really mourning is that sweet combination of stability and possibility. That feeling that the world was opening up instead of closing down. And honestly, in many ways, I feel like the tail end of that lived on for a good 10 to 15 years into the millennium. But now, it's like something shifted around a decade ago. And now it's all a bit like we're collectively holding our breath or treading water, what with climate anxiety, housing crisis, polarisation, algorithmic manipulation, surveillance, job insecurity, a cost of living that doesn't add up, decisions by the government that make no logical sense. Life just feels very weird right now, and with no clear ending in sight. So maybe the important question is, what can we learn from the 90s, and is there anything we can salvage from that time and bring into the present? I mean, banning phones for kids might be a good start. Fight for policies that make housing and work opportunities accessible again. Finding ways to have shared cultural experiences, maybe, instead of everyone isolated in their own little algo bubble. And hey, we're all here together right now on YouTube, which is an amazing platform. We wouldn't want to lose that. But we can all feel there's something not quite right about the 2020s. And I don't know what the answer is. So until then, I'll just drink my tea and jot down some notes, and I'll bang on a few classic 90s tunes. We'll always have the music. Share in the comments, are you team 90s or team 21st century? And if you're enjoying these kinds of chats with me, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.